Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is the Casual Friday podcast. In this week's podcast, I'll talk about the historical knitting class that I took, and then the wonderful surprise I got that is going to help me understand my own ancestors and what kinds of things, knitted things, they wore. I'll share a pair of socks that I completed for a friend of mine. I'll talk about why I take so many measurements before I knit a pair of socks for someone. And I'll talk about whether or not it is a good idea to knit a surprise gift for somebody in your life. So let's get started. 2 weeks ago, when I was editing the last Casual Friday, a spinning friend of mine who also, well, she actually told me about Gail Wood's farm, the farm that is owned by our Three Rivers Park system and is used to teach the public about where your food comes from. They have a flock of Finn sheep, and Shelley told me about this last fall. And I got very excited and to become a fiber assistant or fiber processing volunteer. And actually, tomorrow is their big shearing event on the farm. So I will be there at the skirting table, skirting fleeces, and then in the next couple of weeks, we're going to start scouring those fleeces, and once they're all scoured, then we'll dye them, and it's the whole cycle all again. So I've been doing this for a year now, and I love it. Well, while I was editing the Casual Friday last week, Shelley texted me and said, hey, there is a World War I knitting class being offered at Gail Wood's tomorrow, meaning Saturday. She said they almost canceled it. Normally, if they don't fill a class, they will cancel it and take it down from the listing, but they're really, really close to having enough people to make the class go. So if you're interested, she's like, I've signed up for it. And I'm absolutely interested because I have a lot of interest in historical knitting. I did that whole project where I knit sweaters from each decade, from the 1890s to the 1990s, and since then, I've been working on a project where I've been knitting stockings from different eras. So World War I is something that's very interesting because there was so much knitting going on worldwide. There was a long war, and there was a lot of press coverage for that. So that was something that was only, I think the Crimean War in the 1850s, I believe it was the first time there were, reporters on the battlefields sending telegrams back. The communication systems were such that could happen. And so by World War I, you have this global way of communicating fairly quickly. And knitting was absolutely in the newspapers all the time. Knitting patterns here in the US, there were knitting patterns in the paper. There were people, calling for people to knit comforts for the soldiers. A lot of sock knitting went on. So there's just a lot of material that I have been able to accumulate and read about in ways that weren't necessarily true for time periods before that. So like printed, published knitting patterns, like actual books devoted to knitting, didn't become a thing until the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. So the first knitting booklet was strictly about sock knitting, and it was aimed at children, poor children, to give them a skill to make them useful to society. And that knitting booklet was published repeatedly throughout the 19th century. And then more books about knitting were published, not just to train children to become servants who could do that sort of work for their employers, but also for middle-class women to have a useful hobby. And then there were people who lived on farms and in remote areas that had to knit their own socks and stockings and hats and mittens for their survival. So they weren't purchasing anything, they didn't have somebody making it for them necessarily, but they could make them themselves, and there were patterns available. So I said, I absolutely want to take this class. I didn't expect to necessarily learn a ton, because I know a lot about knitting. I've done a lot of historical knitting. I've read a lot of historical things, but I thought it would be really interesting to go to this class and see what they had to offer. I don't ever expect when I sign up for a knitting class these days to learn a ton. I hope to learn one new thing each hour. Then it's worth it, and I also enjoy watching the teachers teach to see how they handle their class and how they teach to a group. I'm always interested in that. What was so great about this class, it was taught by a historian who works for the park system. He's an expert on this pioneer, which I think the park system owns that guy's cabin. He's an expert on that, but otherwise he has a broad interest in Minnesota history. And he had two assistants. They were both very experienced knitters. One is his wife, and one was a friend of theirs. And all three of them met, I think, back in the 1990s at Fort Snelling. So historic Fort Snelling is our local, it's a historic site, and I have never actually been there. I was really excited to hear about what they used to do there. So the two women learned to knit while they were working at Fort Snelling, and some of the things that they did was a historical reenactment. So they'd be wearing the costumes, they'd be showing the kinds of crafts that they would have been doing in that time period. One of them had a real interest in 1820s, the other one had a real interest in 1830s. Like me, they have a broad interest in historic knitting. So they were there to support the historian as he was talking through World War I knitting. And so what he did was he had collected so many newspaper articles and statistics and all of this kind of thing on our local history during World War I and what knitters were doing in World War I here in the Twin Cities. And so a lot of that was Red Cross knitting. And so it would be school children, boys and girls. It would be women's groups. It would also be men, all of these different groups, and the amount of knitting that they had done for the war effort. It was very interesting. It was all stuff that I didn't know anything about, and I really appreciated that. When these two women told me that their specific interest was the 1820s and the 1830s, and then they said that they used patterns from that era to produce the things in their historic knitting, I got very excited because I knew the first published knitting booklet that I knew of was published in England in like 1819 or 1821, somewhere around there. And so I wanted to know what patterns that they were using from that era, because I didn't know of any American patterns back then. And they said, oh, there weren't really published American patterns, and they were using the mostly British sources. And they said, but there is a book, and they were thinking about what it was called, and they're like, what is it called? It was like Pennsylvania Dutch clothing, something like that. And they realized it was called Rural Pennsylvania Clothing. And so they were telling me about this book, and I got very excited about it. But I didn't want to, bring the class to a halt about talking about 1820 stuff when we were there to talk about World War I. So we continued on with the presentation, and then they passed around reproductions of a little booklet that came from the Red Cross back during World War I. So this is a Xerox copy of it. It's clearly out of copyright by now. And what we were going to be knitting we would have our choice of knitting these basically ribbed fingerless mittens that would come up the arm to the up here somewhere, and then there would just be an opening on the side. So you had a choice. You could knit it flat and then just sew up and leave a gap for the thumb, or you can knit in the round, and then when you get to the thumb, you knit back and forth for a while, and then you rejoin and knit in the round. We had our choice. And the farm gave us yarn that had been spun from the sheep on the farm, and we could get started. We were knitting away, and then I asked them, can you tell me again the name of that book about Pennsylvania stuff? And they said, oh, it's Rural Pennsylvania Clothing. And I was going to write it down. And the woman was on her phone. She goes, this is what the cover looks like. I'm like, okay. And so I got my phone out and I was Googling it. And the only result that I saw was on Abe Books. So Abe Books is a global, it's owned by Amazon now, but it's a global marketplace for used and rare book sellers, and I have purchased a lot of my vintage and antique knitting books through Abe Books because I could find them there. So I have a whole shelf of them right here. So I saw one on Abe Books, and it was a hardcover, and it was one of those hardcovers that looks like it's a print on demand type of thing. It's like a dark hardcover, and then it's got gold print on it, but it was $300. I'm like, I'm not spending $300. She goes, oh my gosh, no, you can get it way cheaper than that. And mine's paperback. So she goes and she's searching. She goes, there's one on eBay. It's $80. So I went on eBay and I bought it in the middle of this class. I bought that book. It took about a week to get to me, but it showed up last weekend. And this is the book right here. It's called Rural Pennsylvania Clothing. There are photographs because they had these little museums in various parts of rural Pennsylvania where they have these items of clothing that are from the late 1700s and early 1800s. And they have, you know, the leather knee breeches, and they have the shirts, and they have all kinds of things, but some of the things that they had were stockings and mittens. So a lot of it is showing you what they look like. They have actual items from those time periods, and then they have diagrams and stuff to teach you how you can make those. So if you are working in a museum or you're doing historical reenactments or something, you could make your clothing so that you look like you were from someone from that era. Well, era and area. So I was really interested in the knitting section. So I was so thrilled about that. I kept reading about it, and then they had some maps, and they were showing the area that most of these clothing items were from. Now, again, this is rural Pennsylvania, and these were people who were of German descent. So the German immigrants that came over, and then they had these German communities, and they kept speaking German. And I started seeing the area in Pennsylvania that they were talking about. And I was like, oh my God, this is the area where my ancestors came from. And I got very, very excited about that because as an American whose immigrant ancestors mostly came 300 to 400 years ago, I don't have any sort of knitting tradition in my bloodlines. So it's not like a lot of other Minnesotans whose great-grandparents came over from Norway or Sweden or Germany in the late 1800s or early 1900s. And so you've got all of these Norwegians here who are into the Norwegian sweaters or the Swedish knitter, you know, people of Swedish descent are into all that, and they do all of the Swedish or Norwegian things over holidays, and they have the costumes, and they do all of this stuff to, you know, keeping their culture going that they came from. And I don't have any of that. And a lot of those like knitting traditions that people would have brought here were not around when my ancestors would have lived in Europe anyway. So this was really exciting to me. I am descended from maybe 20 to 23 at least families that came over in what was called the 1709 to 1710 Palatine migration. So it was like 2,000 people. They were from like the Rhine Palatinate area, so they were called the Palatines. Not all of them were actually from there, and then later German-speaking immigrants were just called Palatines regardless of where they came from. And this is all before there was an actual country called Germany. There were German-speaking people who were from different duchies and principalities and stuff, but there was no like Germany. So these people came over they had heard these rumors. There was a golden book that came down the Rhine River. This pastor, I think, had put it together, and they would come to these little villages where most people were illiterate, and they would read from this golden book. And as each edition of this book was published, the claims in it got more and more extravagant. But these were people who had been living through all of these wars where soldiers would just come on their land and they'd take their food, take their animals, whatever. They had several winters that were extremely brutal, and the vineyards died. You know, birds were flying in the sky and dropping and just freezing right right from the sky. They were just desperate, and they were being told in this golden book that Queen Anne was giving away land in Carolina, the New World, paying for their passage and then giving them free land. So people started going up the Rhine, and then they went to Rotterdam, and then they took boats across to London, and they were showing up by the thousands. Queen Anne hadn't really made any claim like this, but after a while, these people were there, and they needed to be fed and housed, and they set up camps for them, and they kept census records of them because they were spending money feeding these people. So they had all of the people's names, where they came from, who was in their family, what was being spent on these people. And Queen Anne finally decided, it might not be a bad idea to send a bunch of people over to settle this New World area, bring more families over there without draining all of the labor from my own country. Not going to send the Catholics over there. They're going to go back to Germany, or what would become Germany. And I'm going to send all these Protestants over there. The majority of those people were on these 10 or 11 boats. They got on these ships, and then they spent about 3 months just kind of sailing along the edge of England and not going anywhere. And then finally, they made the journey across, and that took a month. They arrived in New York City, these very sick, not healthy people, 2,000 of them, to New York City, which had a population of about 4,000. And again, these were sick people. So they quarantined them for a while. And the idea was that these people would come over and they would work their debt off of being shipped over and fed and whatever, as basically indentured servants for this business that this guy had for manufacturing naval stores like pitch and tar that would be used for building ships. And so they quarantined them in New York City for a while. Some people ended up going to New Jersey, but a lot of them went up the Hudson River. And then about 3/4 of them ended up on the east bank of the river, and they call that East Camp. And then they had the ones in West Camp. Now, this is in the area of New York where Rhinebeck is, the Rhinebeck, the New York Sheep and Wool Festival. So the East Camp is, the little hamlets that had been formed there is now called Germantown. But these people were all settled there, and they were working and they were doing things. This business of naval stores was not well thought out. They didn't have the right kind of pine trees for tar and pitch. And so they went bankrupt. And so here these German people have been here for 2 years, and some of them ended up staying right where they were. But a lot of the rest of them were like, okay, we're going to go find our own place to live and farm, and we're going to negotiate with the natives here. And so they negotiated with these tribes that were matrilineal, there were matriarchies, so the women were in charge, and they made this deal with them. And so they learned from each other. Some of the Germans sent their children to live with the native people and learned their language. And it was a mutually beneficial thing going for about 10 years. And then the new governor of New York decided, no, we want this land that you guys didn't negotiate correctly for that land. And we want to use it for something else. And so, just because you've been there 10 years, you've done all of this stuff, and you've built this life for yourself, that's not, you're going to have to go somewhere else. We'll give you some land further north and further west than any Europeans had settled before, but you can have that land. So some of my ancestors did that. They went up to this area, which is now called Palatine. And some of them were so fed up, they didn't want anything to do with the English anymore. They went further west and down a river to Pennsylvania, and they settled in this area that was called Topahaken, or Tolpahaken. And there still is Tolpahaken stuff there, but it's not the same location. So I have a few of my Palatine ancestors came down to Tolpahaken, and that is the area just north of that. That is the area that they're talking about in here. And so I had additional German ancestors come in like 1738 to that area and settled. All these German-speaking ancestors, and they stayed there until about sometime in the mid 1800s, and they started moving further west. This is the closest thing I have to finding things that are connected to my own personal history that I could knit and I could use as a project, as part of my project of looking at stockings from different eras and different places. So this is really exciting for me. And so I want to go to the overhead and kind of show you some of the things that are in this book. I wanted to show you this little instruction book that they gave us at the class. And so you can see there's various different things. It's basically, you know, a couple of rectangles that are sewn together. It's a big rectangle with a hole in it. Well, that's what this is. And same thing with like a balaclava. And then here are those mitts. And so you have a choice of knitting them flat and seaming them up the side, leaving a gap, or knitting them in the round. And then they have a bed sock, and they have a regular sock. And there's a scarf and a washcloth and a hot water bottle cover. So that was something that came out in a little pamphlet. Well, I have this book. This is published in 1918. So this is the booklet that I used to knit this sweater, a serviceable sweater, which I really like. But in the middle of this is knitting for the Red Cross. So it's exactly all of the same stuff. There's an extra picture here to show that guy wearing this. And then you've got those mittens right here. So I have all of the pattern. I had all of these patterns already. It was just fun to see this like original pamphlet and all of the other books that they had as well. So this is the book that I am so excited about. So they have all kinds of things, like these are pockets that women would wrap around their waist, and it could have them under their skirt or on top of their skirt. All kinds of shirts and things. And you can see the close-up details that they have of different things. Trousers that they had. These are cloth. They also had some that were leather. So you can see how the fly works in the front. I have things like these leather shoes, different kinds of shoes. And again, these are original ones that are in their museums. Buckles that they had for their shoes. And now we get to the stockings. This is a linen stocking, and it was actually knit so that it was seamed up the back. It's not clear if it was also seamed on the sole. I don't think it was, but it was knit flat in the leg. And then this right here is a fancier one. I think this one is cotton. And if you look at the heel here, so you can see that the heel flap has this heel stitch. And then the turn is what in English we call a Dutch heel. I was so amazed to see this kind of a heel in these older stockings, because the earliest I've been able to find something like this has been more the turn of the 20th century. Particularly started getting more popular during World War I because it was considered more comfortable, but also more durable. So that's really exciting to me. And also to see these kinds of stockings. These remind me a lot of the stockings in another set of books. This is a 3-volume set called Bäuerliches Stricken. It's in the Bavarian dialect, and so it's from like the Austria, Bavarian, northern Italy area where all of these patterns are from. But there are a lot of these women's stockings, so they have all of these different, the men's stockings too, but there is a lot of lace in here that I hadn't seen in other sources for these kinds of stockings. So that just I thought was really interesting. I realized it's from a different part of Germany than where the Palatines came from. But it was interesting to me to see that even those people had these kind of interesting stockings. So they've got examples of their knitting needles, what those were like. And they've got a diagram of how to make and shape the stockings. Because this book is for like people who might want to do historical clothing and reenactments. Like, do they want to do absolutely true to gauge and everything? Or do you want to knit at something that's more reasonable gauge? And then here's how you do the shaping using your information about gauge as well as your actual physical size. So you would make something that would actually fit you. This, I loved seeing this. Let me zoom in a bit more. Again, we see that heel with the heel stitch, but this heel is not turned. It doesn't have that heel turn. It is a shaped common heel. So you see this one here that's in stockinette. Half the stitches were kept on hold, like for the instep, and then they knit the other half just in a stockinette rectangle all the way down. It was folded in half, and then the two sets of live stitches were joined together using a 3-needle bind off, which you can tell that's a 3-needle bind off done from the inside of the work. And there's no shaping here, it's just turn the corner. Whereas this one has, not only is it the different stitch pattern, it's got some decreases here to help create that curve at the back. And again, I'm just so thrilled to see the heel stitch in here. Some of the other things they have are some patterns from original stockings. So they've made some swatches up that came from actual stockings that they've seen. So they've got stitch patterns here that they figured out and they've reproduced for this book. And they have information about rehealing stockings that I thought was really interesting. They also have things about colors, and they used indigo, but they used other things too, like purple and things like that. Here is a pair of socks. This one is not, or a bunch of stockings. This one's not completed, but some of these are linen. So like toe and linen stockings. I think toe is, so when you are preparing the flax in order to be spun, like you get these incredibly long fibers, and then you get the stuff that's called toe that comes off of it. It's the shorter fibers. So I sounds like a lot of the times the stockings were made from this toe. I don't know what the difference would be in the fabric that you would create from toe versus from spun flax that normally you would call linen once it was fabric. I don't know. So here's a sock that was never completed. This is just very exciting for me to discover that while there isn't written patterns that I can follow, which is totally fine, that there are sources for actual physical things that are similar to what my ancestors would have been making and wearing, and that I can replicate these as part of my project, knowing that this is something a little closer to home than maybe some of the other things that I've been knitting for my stocking project. At the end of October, I flew down to Destin, Florida, and met up with 6 of my college, well, sort of 7. My old roommate's husband was there too. We knew him in college. We didn't go to college with him. So there was 8 of us down there, and we just had a wonderful time. We hadn't all been together for more than 30 years. And it was so much fun. And I was knitting a sock the whole time. They were fascinated by that. And at one point I said, you know, I'm happy to knit socks for any of you that want socks. And so 2 of them raised their hand, and I traced their feet and measured them. And then pretty soon everybody wanted socks or gloves. One friend wants gloves instead. So I've been working on those. So last Casual Friday, I showed you the socks that I made for my friend Patrick, who's my oldest friend of the group. I've known him since we were 15 in Algebra 2 class. So I made his first. I started working on the next pair of socks, which is for my friend Brian. So these are those socks. He wanted things in blues and greens. So I had this yarn from, it's a company, or she's an indie dyer. She's called Turtle Pearl. And this yarn is called Striped Turtle Toes, is like the base that she uses for it. And what she does is she takes 50 grams of 250-gram skeins of yarn, and she dyes them identically. And then they'll absolutely match each other. And then you can also get with that, or you do get with that, I'm not sure. I don't know if it was an option or if that's just how it came. 25 grams of a contrast color that you can use for the heels and toes and cuffs. My friend Brian has pretty large circumference feet and ankles, and I decided to make his socks toe up because I was worried about, making sure all of the yarn lasted. And as I was knitting them, I started to realize, oh, there's not a problem at all with the striped yarn, because he didn't really want his socks. He lives in Southern California, out in the desert area. So he just wears socks around the house instead of shoes, and he didn't really need like long wool socks. So they're shorter in the leg, but I used nearly every bit of the contrast yarn for the toes, the heels, and the cuffs. But I was worried about it, so that was why I was working toe up. But they really do match, and what's really nice is that the striping pattern does not repeat. So they match each other, but there's no repeat. I have so much of the self-striping left. I have almost 50 grams. I think I have 48 grams left. I think that I can make myself, for sure, a pair of shorty socks, like for summertime, for when we go hiking. So, I mean, this is just so much left over. But again, I think I had 1 or 2 yards of the contrast color left over. That was really close, which is another reason I wanted to go toe up, because I thought if that wasn't going to last, or if I didn't have enough, I could start the ribbing and the striping color and then shift to the contrast, or just do the edging and a contrast. I wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen. When I knit socks for somebody, they're always a custom fit. I always trace their foot, so I know exactly how long their feet are, and I can see the shape of their toes. I measure the ball of their foot and their ankle. Theoretically, these are the same. Like, that's how sock patterns are designed, is with the assumption that the ankle and ball of foot are the same. So often they'll just tell you to measure one of them, the ankle or the ball of foot. Some patterns will say ankle, some will say ball of foot. And I know, because I have fit issues with the heel, that I want to take measurements that are going to make sure that heel is going to fit. I used to measure the distance from the middle of the outer ankle bone. So not the one that's in between your legs, but the one on the outside, from the middle of that bone to the floor, so I could know what length I needed for the heel flap. And that isn't enough if you want to do other kinds of heels. And for some people, it's really hard to measure. So I now do the heel diagonal. So that's taking the circumference from, where your leg is meeting your ankle, this circumference around here. And I find that I can get a really good idea of, if I am going to do a heel flap, exactly how many stitches I'm going to need from that. I did a video when I figured this out a few years ago. So I did do a video on that, which I will link above if I remember, and down below. But I also used it to figure out if I want to do like peasant heels or short row heels, or the heel that I tend to like to do most now, which is called a plain heel. It's basically a peasant heel, but rather than being an afterthought or forethought, it's an instathought. So when I get to where the heel is going to be, I can knit it then using this peasant heel where you're knitting in the round. And I can make adjustments to get a really good fit at that point, because I don't have to use the number of stitches that I used for the ball of foot, or if I'm going cuff down, I don't have to use the number of stitches that I use for the leg, because of how that works. And I will leave links down below to that as well, because I find that oftentimes like a short row heel or a peasant heel, whether it's instathought, forethought, afterthought, I need to make adjustments in order to make it fit. So this is how I knit socks. Now, I mentioned this when I was talking about this initially a few weeks ago, and I had a question in the comments about somebody was knitting a surprise pair of socks for, I don't know, I think it might be her son-in-law. And she knew his shoe size, and she was hoping that would be enough to make a pair of socks that fit him. And what I said was, maybe, maybe they'll fit him great. Maybe he'll be able to get them on their feet. They won't fit great, but he'll be able to wear them. And the other option is maybe he won't be able to get them on his foot at all. And that was the issue I had the first time I knit a sock with a short row heel. I could not get it past my heel because my heel diagonal is so much larger than you would expect for someone whose ankle and ball of foot measurements are what they are. I have a really high arch, and that makes that heel diagonal really long. So I always measure, and every once in a while I'll see somebody where I'm like, wow, they are the absolute textbook average. I don't have to make any adjustments. Their ankle and ball of foot are the same circumference, and their heel is, I don't have to change anything. I can do the standard formulas in order to knit their socks, and I just have to know how tall they want the sock and how long their foot is. And that has happened a couple of times. Often there's a pretty significant difference between the person's ankle and ball of foot. And the other thing is that their shoe size does not necessarily indicate what the circumference of their foot or ankle is going to be. And certainly isn't going to tell you whether they're the same as each other. And it doesn't point to any other kind of fit issues that somebody might have. So I want to go back to the overhead, and I want to kind of show you, just for men that I have knit for, if they had told me their shoe size, how I would have interpreted that and whether or not it would have fit them. But also I want to look at their ankles and ball of foot circumferences and show how different those are from one person to another. I wanted to get a little information from my friends that I have knit socks for so far. I had all of their measurements, but I wanted to find out if I could have knit them socks that would fit them if all I knew was their shoe size. So I texted Brian, and he told me that he used to wear a size 11, but because he hasn't really been wearing shoes much in the past 15 years because he's been working from home, that now he comfortably wears a size 12. So I would have taken that information, a size 12, and I would use that to determine how long to make the sock foot. Now, I don't know how I would have determined what his ankle or ball of foot if I could have asked him one or the other and gotten that piece of information and then tried to knit a sock based on that. And then I asked my friend Pat what shoe size he wears, and he said 10.5. So let's look at the sizing information for them. So Pat wears a 10.5, and so when I look up on a shoe sizing chart, that means that the person would have a foot that is 10 13/16 long. So in American shoe sizes, each size goes up 1/3 of an inch when you go from like a 10 to an 11. It would be 1/3 of an inch, which we never use those kinds of things. So they use 16ths in order to approximate things more. Now my friend Brian said that he wears a size 12. Now that would be 11 1/3 inches. Both of them, however, when I traced their feet, had feet that were 11 inches long. So Pat is able to get his foot in a 10 and a half shoe. Brian needs a 12, but they have the same length foot. And if we look at the difference, like this is a centimeter or 1/3 of an inch difference between what the shoe size he wears is and what his foot is. But between the two of them, that's, even more. That's, what have we got? 3/16, so it's about 1/4 of an inch. So we've got a good 1/2 inch or more difference between the shoe sizes that they wear, but they actually have the same length of foot. The first two men that I knit for were my husband and my mom's husband. And this is where I thought, oh, I do have weird feet. Most people do follow the sort of the formula. Both of them have a 9-inch ankle and a 9-inch ball of foot. Their foot lengths were close enough. I had one record somewhere that said Al's was 11 1/4, but I remember being able to use Michael to try on socks I knit for Al, and then they would fit him. So based on this length, Al should wear an 11 1/2, but I don't know. He's dead, so I can't ask him anymore. Based on my husband's foot length, he should wear an 11. I asked him, he says he wears an 11 to an 11 1/2. It just varies. So in inches, that's 11 to an 11 3/16. And I realize these aren't centimeters. I understand that. Let's call that half a centimeter difference. So these are my two friends that I already talked about. Now we get into my daughter's friends from high school and college. And they both have feet that were 10 1/2 inches in length, which should mean that they have shoe sizes that are 9 1/2. I can't ask them. I don't have their ability to contact them. And their feet were very close. They both had a 9 1/2 inch ball of foot, but one of them had a slightly larger ankle, 9 3/4. Probably not enough of a difference to adjust that in a sock. Josh's was a little bigger, 10 inches. Now look at this. They have smaller feet than any of these people, but they've got bigger ankles and ball of feet, or they've got bigger ankles. So you can't predict what's going to happen. Now this is my daughter's fiance. He's got a 9-inch ankle, but he's got a 10-inch ball of foot, just like my friend Pat. But his feet are quite a bit shorter than Patrick's. So they're very similar, but they have a discrepancy that's enough of a discrepancy between their ankle and ball of foot that I would absolutely make adjustments in the circumference of the sock foot versus the sock leg. And then we've got my brother. He's got a 10-inch ankle, not unlike Josh, smaller than Brian's. My brother's ball of foot is over 11 inches. He's got the biggest ball of foot of all, and he's also got the longest feet. Now, his foot length should suggest that he wears an 11 1/2 foot. But if I had judged the length of his socks by asking him, what's your shoe size? He actually wears a size 13 shoe, which correlates to a foot that's longer than he has. The reason my brother wears a size 13 shoe is because when they measure his foot, and you've got, your kind of bone that sticks out there, when they measure from there to there, his foot is the length of somebody who has size 13 feet. But he has very short toes. So he has a lot of wiggle room in his shoes, but he has to have bigger shoes in order to fit the majority of his foot. So there's, the size shoe you wear doesn't always indicate how long your foot is, and it doesn't tell you anything about how big around your foot is and whether or not your ankle is the same circumference. So this is why I always take measurements. You can get lucky. I could have gotten very lucky with my husband. What size shoe do you wear? Oh, you must have a foot this long and average size ankle ball of foot. No problem. And I would have thought, boy, I'm great at knitting socks. And then nothing would have fit anybody else going forward. So this is why I always take all those measurements. One of the things that I learned as a knitter, and I don't know that I learned this the hard way, but I learned this by finding a pattern in yarn, for example, that thought, oh, so-and-so would really like this. And I would show it to them because I would want to make it for them. And they'd be like, not really. And so then we would look for a pattern and then look for yarn. And it would be quite different from what I had assumed they would want. Now, the only exception to this was when I knit for my mother. She loved colors, and so I could knit her any kind of wild socks, and she would love them. She had to make sure that they went with whatever outfit she was wearing, whatever pants and stuff she was wearing. But she loved them. I could knit her any kind of sock. And then I knit her a few other things too, and she always loved them, always. But everybody else, I really ask, like, I ask people, would you like me to knit something for you? And I always tell them, and I mean this, I will not be offended if you say no. But please do not try to spare my feelings by saying, oh, yes, and then not really wanting something, because I don't want to spend my time knitting something for you that you don't actually want. And I want you to really like it. And so I want you to be involved in picking it out. So that's part of it. And then the other thing is, if you live long distance, like you don't see somebody often enough to take measurements of them at a convenient time, and you ask them, would you like me to knit you a hat, or would you like me to knit you socks? And they are very enthusiastic and about it, and they really want it. And they will not take 5 minutes to measure their head or measure their feet or trace their feet and put it in an envelope and send it to you. If they will not do that, I don't care how enthusiastic they are, do not knit for them, because you will spend 5 hours on a hat, 20 hours on a pair of socks that you're trying to guess at because they didn't send you that information, and then it doesn't fit them. And then they're really excited for what you made them and then disappointed because it doesn't fit. So these are things that I understand people are like, I understand completely that knitting is a way to express your love and that you're putting all this time into it and it's very meaningful, but it isn't to the other person. It isn't meaningful to them if they don't want hand knit things. And it isn't meaningful to them if you knit them a lace sweater in pink with ruffles on it, and they actually would have preferred a navy blue turtleneck and would never be caught dead in something like that. They might really appreciate the effort you went to, and they might even think it's really beautiful. But if they would never wear something like that, it's a disappointment for everyone. And so my goal is to make sure that people really want something, because I've got enough knitting to do. I don't need to knit for someone who doesn't want what I'm knitting. And either be really clear on their taste, not just you think you know what they would want, because I know from experience, people do not pick out what I think they would pick out, even when I think I'm looking at it from their eyes. And don't assume that someone's going to appreciate all the work you put into it if they're not the kind of person who likes or wants handmade things, or who wasn't asked what their taste was. So it can be really touchy, and people can be really sensitive about other people's reactions to what they've knit. So I try to set it up so that everybody's happy, including me, especially me. I want to be excited to give them something and that they are actually going to like it. The way that you can surprise somebody, if you truly know what colors they would like or textures or patterns, but you want to surprise them with a hat or a pair of mittens or a pair of socks or a scarf or whatever, is that when you're all together with your friends or with your family or whatever, first of all, you ask them, would you ever want me to knit you something sometime in the future? And if they say yes, ask them what kinds of things, and then measure them. Trace their hands, trace their feet, measure their head, do all of this stuff, and then you have it. You have it in a folder, and then at some point in the future, they may have forgotten that you traced it, or they may not have forgotten it, but have no idea, well, I wonder if they're going to knit something for me this year. I wonder what they are going to knit. So it will be a surprise. If you do that ahead of time, then you have it for all the future. And you could just make this a habit when you get together at a gathering, is go around and measure people. And they'll get used to that, and they'll forget about it, and they won't necessarily expect something every gift-giving occasion from you, but you have that in your back pocket in case you want to do it. So that's my suggestion as we are right into that gift-giving time of year. Some of you have probably also already got your surprise gifts. Just keep your expectations manageable, is what I would say, if you have never knit for somebody and you are knitting for them this year. That's all I'm saying, is ask people if they want it, and do not be offended if they do not. Make it clear that you will not be offended, and believe that. Like, work on not being offended, because there's so many people you could knit for besides that person. I'd be really interested to know what all of you have experienced when you have knit surprise gifts for people, whether the recipients have loved it, maybe not loved it, or loved it but been disappointed because something didn't fit. Let me know your stories about surprise gift knitting down in the comments below. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below. Or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.